Hey folks, Darren with Fervent Astronomy. Today we're looking at this. Yeah, it's another one of these. The Samyang 135 F2 ED UMC? Something like that, I think. I got that. Anyway, correction on the screen if I didn't. I was at the Northern Prairie Star Party this past weekend, which is my local astronomy club's, I guess, star party that they run. And my buddy was there, and lo and behold, he owns this lens. And this is, I'm just gonna, holding my hand up is making me tired. He owns this lens and was kind enough to let me give it a go. It was the Canon EF mount version, but it comes in a range of mounts. Since it was designed for, I guess, DSLR cameras, that flange distance allows it to be mounted to basically anything. And I think Samyang or Rokinon, if you're in North America, sells it as such. But yeah, I posted a video reviewing the Samyang AF135 F1.8 and got a couple of comments about the F2 version. So now we're gonna look at that. How convenient. The lens is what you would expect from, I would say, a classic Samyang lens. You know, it feels fairly well in the hand, a lot of metal, no electrical communication, at least with this one, physical aperture ring, physical manual focus ring, no AF. That's all you need for Astro, right? Has a plastic hood. The focus ring I felt fine, and overall it is just very much what a classic Samyang lens or Rokinon lens feels like. So no, there's nothing really else to talk about, right? No custom buttons, whatever. I can't even remember the filter diameter. I guess I could have looked that up, but it's right here. So let's just jump right into Lightroom and see what these samples look like, because that's what we're here for anyway. Hey folks, welcome to Lightroom. Today we're looking at the Samyang 135 F2 ED UMC for pretty much every mount, I think. In this case, I had access to a Canon EF mount lens, and I adapted it to a Sony a7R Mark V 60 megapixel camera, nice and high resolution, so that we can put this lens through its paces. You'll notice if you watch many of my reviews that we just have one single set here. We're not doing an untracked set. These are all tracked for 60 seconds with the Fornax Mounts LighTrack II. Now you may be aware or not, but Fervent Astronomy is Fornax's North American distributor. So if you want to learn more about all that, head on over to ferventastronomy.com and maybe learn more. That being said, why am I shooting all of these at ISO 320? You might be asking yourself, because if I come over here, this is what the image looks like out of camera. I've boosted these so that we can actually take a look. So why am I doing that? Well, the Sony a7R Mark V is an ISO invariant camera. It essentially has two analog amplification steps. It has a dual gain sensor. And what this means is that pretty much every other ISO in the camera is digitally amplified, which is the same as if I just come up here and boost the exposure in Lightroom. Now, if I were to shoot this at ISO 3200, sure, that might give me a nice view on the back of the camera, but I'm not going to gain anything by doing that, and I might lose some things. What might I lose? Well, if you do that, you're going to lock in your highlights at whatever that higher ISO is. And while the noise will be the same and the ability to lift the shadows will be the same at 3200 as they are at 320, at the higher ISO, I might lose the ability to recover highlights if they get blown out. So when would this be an issue? Well, think galaxy cores, bright nebulae, stars, for instance, as well. So this is why I shoot at 320. If you want to learn more about that, head on over to the description. There's a link. It'll bring you back to the website, and I've got an article link there, which is written by much smarter people than me, and it gives you the whole rundown on what's going on. You'll also find a link back to these samples. Should you want to download them full raw, pixel peep, check the corners out, process them, do all that good stuff, it will provide you with that. But please keep in mind, these are my copyrighted works. I know they're not great works of art, but they did require effort on my behalf. So please don't use them for your own reviews. Please don't misrepresent them as your own. Please don't distribute them online or otherwise. Just in good faith, use them for the singular purpose they're being provided. which is to assess this lens. Now, all that out of the way, let's see what we have here. We have a single focus frame. So this is shot using a Bahtinov mask. These diffraction spikes can help us assess focus and field curvature or flatness across the frame. And then we have stopping down from F2 to F4. And that's it. So let's pop into here. First thing we're going to do is check out that center. Now, if you're not familiar with how a Bahtinov mask works, it creates these diffraction spikes. And when you focus, you can line up the 3 spikes, so the 2 diagonals and the center one, and where they intersect symmetrically, boom, you're done, great focus. Now, if we look around, we can start to see if things are out of focus anywhere. So for instance, here, there's maybe, I don't know if you see this gap here as it gets towards the center, might be a little bit narrower than this side. That's indicating that maybe this, even though it's pretty close, is out of focus a little bit. If we go down this way, here we see the same sort of thing. That spike, that center spike is a little bit more to the left, so it's giving a different representation there. It's not a huge amount, it's not a huge deal, but it is there. If we move up to here it actually still looks pretty good. Now that's another thing. It's not to say that field curvature means that you'll get a linear gradient to focus. You're looking at the results of glass that's formed into a specific shape by people. It's not going to be completely perfect, and that glass is trying to bend light and then project it onto a flat plane. So you might get the center in focus, but the edge is out of focus with some lens or another. Sometimes you might get the center in focus and different amounts of out of focus around that, and then maybe it gets a little bit better towards the edges. It can manifest a whole bunch of different ways. Checking down here we can see we're losing focus again in that same direction with these stars as well. This one, since it's not flaring as much, you can see that center spike's kind of off. And here it's a little bit difficult to see. Once you get to the edges and corners, sometimes the spikes can disappear. So this one's really faint. It's a little bit hard to see, but overall, while there is some field curvature in this lens, I don't think it's really a huge deal. It's very minimal. It's very common. I would say that's not too much to worry about. One thing I do want to note before we dive into the rest of them, while the first couple at the wider apertures are nice and clean, the later ones, we did have a cloud roll through, a little bit of haze, and it did bloat the stars a teeny bit. So please keep that in mind. For this photo at f2, this is wide open. Let's assess. If you look at the navigator, we can see that there's darkening in the corners and brightening in the center. So this is vignetting in the corners. That brightening in the center is an indication of maybe a little loss of contrast. I'll just stop down a smidge. And already, sometimes it is easier to see in the smaller navigator where it's zoomed out. You can see that we have a more even exposure through most of the center of the frame now. And then if we stop down here, we're at f2.8, getting, I guess, technically more even still, but we're starting to get quite dark, and we're darkening the corners as well. And then if we stop down all the way to f4, we're quite dark. So that's, I don't think, a worthwhile trade-off. And you can see here these stars have bloated out because a little bit of haze came through there. So that is, please keep in mind, not something that the lens is doing. That is very much sky conditions. But this little bit of contrast change in the center, that is the lens. So you have to decide if it's worth it to you, because it might actually, while it is lowering contrast a little bit, it might actually be bringing with it some extra exposure. If we zoom in on the center, we can see that we do have a bit of spherical aberration, maybe just a smidge. We are at 400%, keep in mind, but you can see the star, we're losing a little bit of contrast around it, sort of hazing out. And there are tines here, even wide open, which is sort of worsening that issue. Not a huge deal breaker or anything, but something to be aware of. Like I had mentioned, we are focused here at basically perfect focus for this one star in the center. And if we go here to the frame without that, like very next frame, you can be assured that things here are probably pretty in focus, but there is a little bit of chromatic aberration. And here you can see these stars are quite yellow, and they're getting a little bit of sort of fringing. I had another set, and they had the traditional blue-purple fringe. And what's happening here, and I believe it's happening with these yellow stars here, is that essentially the lens is not focused the yellow at the same spot as everywhere else. Basically, the yellow's blurring out because it's literally blurry. The yellow light is out of focus a smidge. When we see the blue or the purple fringing, that means that that blue light, or in the case of purple, usually blue and red light, are not perfectly in focus, they're out of focus. And this is a part where some of you might have learned that not all colors in a lens get focused at the same spot. And that's one of the reasons why there's such complicated optical formulas, because you might get one kind of light in focus, but not another color. And then that will make your image look blurry. So a lens is trying to do its best to focus all colors in the same spot. And based on how really precise you are with your focus, you might get a situation like this, or you might get a situation where you have a bit more, I guess, of a purplish bluish tinge. Some lenses, when perfectly focused, will always have a fringe. It just kind of depends on the lens. But in this case, as we can see, we're pretty much bang on, and this is what we got. So here on the left is our original sample. Here on the right is our other sample. And you'll notice here, slight fuzziness of yellow. Here we've got a more recognizable purple bluish fringe, sometimes a little bit more reddish. What's happening on the left is the point we're focused, which is technically almost clinically perfect. We're using the Bahtinov mask. And what's happening is the lens is not focusing the yellow wavelengths quite in the same, by the same amount. So they're bloated out a little bit. On the right, smidge, just a smidge difference. But that smidge keeps the yellow in focus, but then the blues and reds get out of focus. So the purple is a combination of blue and red being out of focus. And here where it's more reddy pink, I think you don't need an explanation of what's going on there. And you'll have blues, more primarily blues on different stars as well. So yeah, it's all right. Here we have the Pac-Man Nebula. And I don't know that I have much else to say. I don't really notice too much in like the coma department in the center here. So that's good to see. Now, before we get to the corners, I will mention that what many of you have been told is coma or may have seen in reviews or stuff online is actually not coma. Coma is what happens when you get a star and you'll have one edge of the star get blurry and fuzzy and the other edge will remain sharp. And it might take the form of a bit of a wedge or a delta shape. You know, it might blow it out into kind of a little bit of a triangular shape there. And what that is chromatic aberration or coma. And this is when the lens is fuzzing one side of these bright pinpoints out, these, for all intents and purposes, specular highlights. Usually worse towards the edges, but it can be found in the center if the lens is causing it. And it gains its name from coma from comets because it ends up looking like a little comet, right? So that's what coma is. What many of you might call coma would be actually something called astigmatism. So let's look over here. So here we have these little starfish shapes, and this is a perfect example of astigmatism. This one's actually a fairly complex shape. A lot of times it'll appear to be like a little fighter jet flying through the edges of your frame, or maybe even like a little flock of seagulls or something like that. But essentially, astigmatism is when the lens can't focus a pinpoint into a point. So in the center here, we're getting the light focused into more or less a point. It's a star. As we get to the outside, along radii that go from the center to the edge of the frame, stars will stretch out in the case of something called tangential astigmatism. So that will, along a line like this, you'll find that all the stars will kind of stretch out. And as you go to different points in the frame, they might appear a little bit different, but they might stretch out in that direction as well, even if their general shapes change. So you can see there's kind of a stretching this way. So that is tangential. Sagittal astigmatism is the same thing. The lens can't focus a point into a point, and it stretches it out laterally. So at a 90-degree angle to that tangential astigmatism. So tangential astigmatism will be along these radii from the center to the edge, and sagittal will almost appear to ring the frame. It will always kind of point at an angle there. So here the little bluish wings on these stars are sagittal astigmatism. This little bluish bit on this side, along with, you know, this business, this is tangential astigmatism. And this one almost looks like it has little feet and like a little tail. There's all different kinds of shapes that will pop out of this. Sometimes they'll be different across the frame, but you just have to take my word for it, I guess, or go do some research. These are the two types of astigmatism that we just discussed. Now the blue is that purple fringing. That is chromatic aberration. That's the lens not focusing the blue quite as much as it's focusing some of the other wavelengths here. So while in the center we might have maybe a little bit of yellow not quite getting where it needs to be. This purple blue is very classic, and this is classic as well, where the red is in opposition, or the warmer colors are in opposition. So that's a pretty classic example of chromatic aberration mixed with astigmatism. And if we look around the frame here, this is the edge, more astigmatism, corner. Here the darkening, the vignetting, is hiding some of the astigmatism a little bit. You will find that the darker it is, those parts where they get really out of whack will get hidden a little bit. So if you were to expose more, or if we're going to brighten up these, we're probably going to pull some more out of the murk there. But since there wasn't any especially bright stars up here, except for maybe like here, it doesn't show up that much. This bright star is fairly near the edge, and this is the lighthouse effect here. So you're getting this sort of darker, higher contrast wedge on either side, and then along that radii from the edge to the center of the frame, you do find that it's essentially stretching out. Although in this case, it does appear to be sort of blurring. It is happening along that general direction there. So here, when this type of thing happens, it can become noticeable. I do notice it here a little bit, here and here as well. This one's going to be not as bad, I think. And well, I mean, maybe technically, but obviously when we're zoomed in, it's pretty noticeable. And this one I think is the worst one, just because it's brighter relative to the darker background here. So you can see, at least to my eye, it looks stretched out this way, almost like a hourglass. And as we zoom in here, we see, yeah, that's exactly what we're having. On the medium bright stars, we do have that astigmatism, and it's fairly consistent with that starfish shape. So that's good. That tells us there's some symmetry across the frame. And anywhere you get the brighter stars, that's going to happen. Bottom corner, same. At least it's nice and symmetrical, that's good. Now, all lenses are going to have some aberrations. It's just a fact of reality and manufacturing. When it becomes a problem to me is when it affects the viewing of the actual image. The experience of the viewer might be changed by that. Now you can use that for artistic, I guess, reasons, because it can be a drawing influence. It can draw to the center of the frame. It can also equally be distracting. And if you're aiming to stack your shots, then it's pretty much going to stop you from doing that if it's really bad, because things towards the edge, the stars will become big, for lack of a better word. Like they'll take up more space, they'll become noticeable, and they're not going to fall in line with, you know, their other selves when you're trying to stack multiple images if there's any kind of frame shift at all. So if you're doing dithering, or, you know, if you're getting like a little bit of drift, you will find that stacking will not like that. So depending on what you're doing, it can be an issue. But from a single frame perspective, if it's not making the stars in the edges and corners look big and weird, I typically don't mind it. I always find that little Pac-Man nebula fun. Let's take a little cycle through the apertures here. Zoomed in on the center. This is F2. This is 2.4. Now the lens doesn't label them, and there's no electronic connection with the lens. So I had to do my best, and I just went at half stops. So halfway between F2 and F2.8 is 2.4. And here we can see already just that one little notch down, we get quite prominent tines on a sun star here. That's just one in from the max aperture. That's pretty early, but this is what you can expect to deal with. And you will want, if you are stacking and doing this, to try and it's really tough to do like two separate imaging runs and make them go together, because the tines, unless you're in exactly the right rotation, will not line up. So in this sort of case, it's better to try and do one run and stack that and hope for the best in that regard. Hopefully your tracking is good and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, so this is 2.4, 2.8. Interestingly enough, it gets a lot darker at 2.8, but also blurrier, less defined sun star tines there. 3.3, halfway between 2.8 and 4. And we are seeing that things have gotten thinner, but also blurrier, and just kind of like a lower contrast haze around the star. And F4, this is my reminder that the haze is real because it's actual real haze. So this frame, and maybe to a lesser extent this frame, we're suffering from that. I think here we were still clear. Yeah, and we'll scroll through some other samples really quick just to show you for posterity. And just to prove here that this lens doesn't really bloat the stars up when you stop down, we're going to compare it to this other one here. And here we've got bloating here where it looks like got a little bit of smudginess. Either the tracking wasn't as good or bumped the tripod or something, but here we can see this is what the star should look like at f4, getting some odd, it almost looks like a flower. In that context, it's kind of pretty. And this is it in the other shot here, where the haze is kind of bloating things out. So I will include these other samples, I think, as well. So let's take a little look in the corner. This is f2, 2.4. I'm not seeing really any change at 2.4. So if you do look at the navigator, though, as discussed before, we do get better contrast at 2.4, so you might choose to shoot at 2.4 anyway. 2.8, we're starting to get darker just overall. And maybe the sagittal astigmatism, like the little wings here, are resolving a teeny bit, but not any terrible amount. 3.3, sure, the sagittal astigmatism is getting corrected a bit, but look how dark it is. And the tangential is not getting resolved much, maybe a smidge, but not much. And f4, it's just a darker version of f3.3. So I don't think it's worth stopping the lens down to f2.8 under any circumstances, really. But I would maybe stop it down to that first half stop there. Now that we've taken care of that, we'll come here into the develop module and remove chromatic aberration. Let's see if it helped out. You can watch here, there's a bit of a color shift. What it's doing is it is correcting out some of the probably warmer color. And if we want to get rid of those fringes, we can come in here. Oh, this might make things wacky, we'll see. No, it did clean up that purple fringe. Things here are still pretty good. I don't know if this is going to, oh yeah. So you can defringe that greeny yellow color there a little bit as well. And I don't think it damages the file at all, so you should be okay. So we've got the H alpha here still with the Pac-Man. Now, does this have a profile? All right, luckily this lens does have a profile correction built in to Lightroom, so that's all right. Not a lot of vignetting correction when you enable it. The corners are still staying very dark, but there is a slight correction of distortion around the edges. So in the center of the frame, it doesn't look like it's getting any geometric transformation. And then from about this point to the edges and corners, things are getting brought towards us. So I guess it's almost like this lens has flat barrel distortion where the center is fine, but the rest has that barrel wraparound effect. And if we come in here and we just scale down the transformation, you can see what's happening here. A little dip here in the middle. So what's happening is it's pulling the corners out, stretching them to try and bring them back into line with the flatness that you would expect. And in doing that, we lose, if you watch these stars in the corners, like just the most minute amount of field of view. So I don't think that's a huge deal. I would definitely run the corrections, although you're probably going to want to come here and do your own vignetting correction to give things a bit of a more even appearance. But that's not too bad. All right, I think that kind of wraps it up. That was probably a long one. So let's get her done. All right, well, what'd you think about that? Just going off memory, obviously. Similar performance, I would say, to the 135 F1.8, at least when stopped down. I think the 1.8 maybe had a little more coma happening around the frame, but same sort of deal. A little bit of astigmatism, a little bit of field curvature. It's pretty standard. So with this particular lens, I might stop it down by that half stop to whatever it was, f2.3 or 2.4 or whatever it would have been, halfway between f2 and 2.8, and that seemed to clear up the little bit of like contrast loss, and then just go and be happy. It might be difficult to stack frames with this particular lens, or to do, let's say, like a pano kind of setup, because there is that astigmatism on the brighter stars and the edges and the corners. So you could probably do it, but you might have to crop a little bit more and that type of stuff. But overall, It's a pretty cromulent lens, and it's definitely an option out there. So if you are interested in that lens, hopefully this helped you make a decision one way or the other. Anyway, I'm Darren. This is Fervent Astronomy. Thanks so much, and hopefully we'll see you in the next one. I don't know why I thought black was a good idea.